Hi. For this last episode of my summer break and of Season 5 of Beyond the Thesis with Papa Ph.D., I'm bringing you a great past conversation about how to pivot into the private sector, my conversation with Terence Milstead. Happy listening. Welcome to Beyond the Thesis with Papa Ph.D., the podcast that delves into the diverse and impactful roles scientists can play beyond the lab. With me, David Mendez.
That's a tension that I felt that we have to be very careful. We don't want to come across, and we don't want to be, in fact, people who are just extracting things for our own benefit. And so for me, one of the key elements of networking and doing it in a way that feels right is looking for where's the mutual benefit and framing it that way and being upfront about that, right? Because I'm not looking to expand my circle of golf friends, right? I'm looking for professional connections. But I think framing it as, hey, I really think that, we might be able to work together in the future because we have these overlapping interests, right? That's different than coming across as very sort of self-serving.
Welcome to this new episode of Papa Ph.D. Today, I have the pleasure of having with me Terence Milstead. Terence received his Ph.D. in Urban and Regional Planning in 2008 from Florida State University, where his research was focused on factors that influence people to invest time, money, and emotional energy into upgrading their dwellings, even in unstable housing markets. This question led him to the former Soviet Union on a Fulbright and subsequently to other parts of the globe. But it also ignited a deep interest in qualitative research and the power of deeply listening to others. After completing his PhD, Terence started down the academic career path. However, after a few years, he realized that a full-time career in academia was not what he had envisioned. So in 2014, he transitioned to the private sector, to a research-based consulting, relocating to the East Coast. But the path from academic to private sector consultant was a crooked one and didn't happen overnight. In this episode, he's going to share how he came up with a transition plan that ultimately led him to his current position as Head of Qualitative Insights at a global strategic consulting firm based in Washington, D.C. Super happy to have you here today, Terence. Thank you so much, and super eager to hear your story.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you for that introduction. Couldn't have said it better myself.
So, Terence, we kind of alluded quickly to the journey that you had. We also mentioned that it was a crooked road, which it always tends to be. Things are never super simple. What could you add? What would be one thing you would add so they have a better picture of who Terence Milstead is as a person, as a human?
One thing, somebody who has a wide-ranging curiosity about human behavior.
Yeah, well, and that can take you very interesting places, and we'll see that. And I'm also very curious about the traveling you did, to do with your research and to do with your academic interests. And the former Soviet Union is one for sure, but I guess we'll potentially touch on that during our conversation.
Absolutely.
So yeah, one of the things why I was super happy to have you on Papa PhD is I come from like life sciences, and a lot of my especially early guests were people whom I knew, whom I had done my PhD in neighboring labs, but still today. For me, I have crossed paths with some people in humanities, but your domain, for example, it is a domain, of the social sciences that is, it's an unknown to me. Like I haven't had conversations with people coming from urban planning and this type of domain, and one of the things that I'd like to do in the beginning of this interview would be very quickly to ask you, what's the day-to-day of someone doing a PhD in that domain?
Well, I guess I would start by saying in the social sciences, there's an entire range of disciplines that can go from, let's say, on one end, you've got anthropology. On the other end, I would put economics, right? So the field can vary from something that's very, very quantitative, like on the economic side, to something that would be much more qualitative, right? And again, I'm making a generalization here, but just to understand that there's a spectrum of disciplines, some of which might even sort of identify more with the humanity side of things, right? And so I say that as a context for explaining that in the social sciences, many of us, we try to adhere to the methodological standards of what we would call the hard sciences, right? The chemistries, the biologies, and by that I mean simply in terms of how we do the research, even though we're looking at social phenomena, right? To structure a research study in a way that it's rigorous, and that if somebody came back in, they wanted to do the same study, right, to see if they got the same results, there's a set of steps that they would follow, right? And it's all sort of laid out. That is my training and background as a social scientist in urban planning, but you could find others from the social sciences who take a very different view of how research is done and how it should be done in the social sciences. And that's an interesting conversation for another time.
Yeah, for another time, for sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was part of my framing. I would say that as somebody who is, so my PhD is in urban and regional planning, but it was awarded to me through the College of Social Sciences at Florida State University, where I did my graduate work. I always identified as an urban sociologist, even when I was getting my PhD, and that's because my doctoral advisor had her PhD in sociology. In fact, she was an epidemiologist as well, and so that's been as a researcher, that was always my professional identity, understanding sort of why people behave the way they do in urban settings, as individuals and as groups of people.
It's interesting, the qualitative versus quantitative. And I do understand that some researchers would tend more to be on one side of that gamut, and some on the other side. And I do understand also why it's important for some specific type of research to kind of stay close to the quantitative methods of hard sciences, life sciences, etc. It makes total sense to me. Thank you for that. Now, the reason why, and we had a conversation, before this interview, where you had mentioned this fact that you had followed this academic path up to a certain point, and then you had felt, okay, this is not what I want long term. But then you also told me that teaching is still something you like to do, and that you still find ways to do, which is very cool. But this questioning that you found, and maybe we can give a short timeline on when that questioning arose in you of, do I want to keep following this track, or do I see myself more fulfilled somewhere else? I think a lot of us doing PhDs, at the end of the PhDs, go through that questioning. And this is also why I was very happy to have you here today, because you seem to have not only felt this question in you, but then found a way, or designed a way, to deal with it. And this is what I'd love to delve into. But can you just quickly talk about that moment of inner transition of feeling, okay, I've been doing this now for a while, but I think where I can thrive is somewhere else?
Yeah, certainly. I think it's important to understand that, and this almost sounds facetious. I don't mean it to be that way. I went back for a master's degree and ended up getting a PhD. Really, and I can explain how that happened, but I didn't go into it thinking I want to be an academic. I went into it thinking I need to get a master's degree to help me professionally. And quite frankly, I fell in love with a research question. And the stars aligned in a lot of ways that I can explain, that just made it a no-brainer to go on for a PhD. But it was the research question that drove me, because I was asking a question that I wanted to know the answer to. It wasn't anybody else's question. And then I had an opportunity to go back to live in Europe again on the Fulbright. So that's what got me through to actually getting that degree. I would say the moment when I suddenly had a moment and realized maybe this is not the place for me was probably the end of my second year on the tenure track at the university down in North Carolina where I was teaching. Because as you and many of your listeners know, your first year of teaching at a university, you are teaching prep courses. I mean, you're teaching courses for the first time. So there's a ton of work in preparing those, and you're publishing like crazy because, that's what you need to do in order to get tenure down the road. And so you're very, very busy your first year. I was fortunate that I left graduate school with 3 peer-reviewed publications already. So I was a little bit ahead of the game there. But by the end of my second year, I kind of looked around and thought, I don't know that this is going to be me for the next 30 years. And I'm being very careful because this is just my personal experience. I landed in a little town on a mountaintop in North Carolina, beautiful place, for about a week. Gorgeous place, but just a very small town. It was not where I would have chosen personally, but the academic life is a bit like the military. You don't choose where you go so much, right? You get assigned, and that's where you are, because making lateral moves from one university to another, that doesn't look good. That's not a good career move, right? And so really it was at the end of my second year where I was just thinking, I just don't see myself here in 20 years. And then it felt like, I have an opportunity because of I had worked professionally prior to that for several years in my 20s, right? And because I had a degree in a field that I felt was somewhat marketable, I felt I had a chance to make a career transition, but the window of time was closing. I intuitively knew that, and it was proven to me when I got out trying to transition into the industry that, you can be in academia too long if you want to make that transition. And it's something that I heard. So it was about the second year in when I really kind of started thinking that way. But, it took me another 3 or 4 years to actually make that move. And a good year and a half to 2 years of that was actively strategizing and trying to make that leap. So it was not something where I just said, I'm going to get out of here. And then I went, because it's not that easy. And B, you need to be more strategic and thoughtful and do some front end work before you try and make that transition.
Exactly, and this makes total sense to me because you've been especially you've said you were just super busy that first year, and I imagine being busy means like all the hours of your day going into that, and none of the hours of your day going into networking, maybe widening your network, etc., etc. None of it, or and I believe anyway. I'm super curious to hear then what in those 2-3 years what the process was to kind of create those bridges to then cross to the other side, or leave the tenure track, but yeah, being so absorbed into that new career where you need to prove yourself, where you need to publish, like you said, and where you're kind of competing in a way or you're kind of in a contest to eventually gain or win this position.
Mm-hmm.
You need to change a bunch of things to then start looking at veering away and establishing relationships that lead to this transition being as smooth as possible.
100%. Yeah. And I can certainly speak to my transition strategy and tell you all about it because I definitely had one. But I would say even before we get to that, it's important to realize in your last semester of your PhD work, right? Not only are you finishing writing a book, basically, you're also on the job market, right? You're sending out applications to universities, which is a huge job all by itself. So for me, at least, there was no time to sort of sit back and be reflective and think, am I going to go the academic route? Am I going to go private sector, government? There's none of that. There's no time. In addition, I don't remember, and I really liked all of my mentors at the university. I don't remember anybody saying to me, maybe you want to think about private sector work or think about government practice, right? Because there's the PhD and sort of the academic life in general is about creating new knowledge, right? And so your mentors at the university, if they invest that time into you, they want you to go out and produce new knowledge and to kind of continue the lineage, so to speak.
Yeah.
So all of those things came together to sort of, I would say, push me along the academic path until I came to that moment where I realized I need to strategize. I mean, just speaking about time constraints, not only, I do remember there was one semester, my second year, in addition to teaching and publishing and doing everything else, I think I was on 13 different academic committees, which is absurd. But, because for anybody who's not aware, when you're on the academic, on the tenure track, it's not just teaching and research. You're expected to do service and to serve on these committees because universities don't run themselves. Academic departments don't run themselves. They depend on faculty members stepping up and doing that. And that all goes into your tenure folder, right, when they're making the decision. So it was a lot of work, certainly.
Yeah. It's interesting the point that you made of, at those last 6 months, time kind of disappears into this like vortex of writing and applying, etc., etc. And my point that I try to drive through with Papa PhD and whenever I can is, if start early. Like ideally, day one of your PhD, you should already start to consider like the multiverse of things you might be doing. Although you might already be focused on professorship, it's useful to start early, doing little things that open your eyes to what's out there, but also put you in contact with people who are out there. I'm thankful that you mentioned that, because the last year is too late in a way, because you're getting into this very, very quick pace of finishing, and the anxiety, and it's not easy to organize a pivot at that stage.
David, I would add something to that, and I was just thinking about it. The other complication is, for me, whenever I wanted to make that transition, timing is such a complicated issue, because I didn't want to leave in the middle of a semester. That's not fair to the students, right? And so you're teaching semester to semester with these little windows of time in between. So trying to time your exit so that it just perfectly coincides with those little slivers of time is almost impossible. And so I can tell you, ultimately what I ended up doing was turning in my resignation at the beginning of a semester, and even before I had anything lined up, because I knew that was the only way I was really going to be able to do it without being unfair to the students and to the department as well, right? You don't want to just turn in 2 weeks' notice. You can't do that.
So going back to that second year and that realization of, I don't see myself doing this or doing just this for 20 years, etc. So you also mentioned that then it took time to set everything up and to prepare everything. What was the first thing? Because I imagine you were in this routine of teaching. Like you said, there's very little off time. What was the first thing that you kind of said, okay, this is a big change on the mid-long term, but I have to start with a small change, I imagine, to begin with, because like you said, I have students, I have, I'm doing all the teaching, I'm taking part in all these committees. Strategically, what was the first thing that you adopted, or the new habit or the new routine to kind of start leading you into that path of pivoting?
The most important thing I did was I picked up the phone and I called somebody who I knew, who was a consultant in my world, on the non-academic side, in the architecture urban planning world, a successful consultant. His name's Joe Minicosi. He might actually be listening. I don't know. He's on my LinkedIn network. And I said to him, listen, Joe, I want to make this change, but I have no idea where to start. And he gave me advice. And this is what the advice was. step number one is figure out where you want to go, where you want to land physically. Okay, so for me, that was the East Coast because that's where I wanted to live, and also that's where there just happened to be a lot of job opportunities. So figure out where you want to go. Step two, set aside money. This is going to cost money. Set aside some money and make networking trips up there as frequently as you can. For me, it was once a month. So once a month for 6 months, I took trips and I hit New York, D.C., and Philadelphia. And these trips would be a few days. I tried to space them around when I wasn't teaching. Step three, before I made any of those trips, I made up a list of everybody who I thought might be an industry player in those places. I went to industry websites, I read the news reports, I did everything that I could, and I came up with this list with email addresses. And before I would go up, each time I would email people and say, and so my message was not, hey, I'm looking for a job, can you help me? I'm coming up. My message was, this is who I am. I'm thinking of relocating to the area. I'd love to buy you a cup of coffee or lunch and just sort of pick your brain so I can expand my understanding of what's happening in the industry landscape. Okay. I did the math. I probably sent out 500 emails and I got about 24 meetings. So it's a numbers game. But those 24 meetings were with elected officials. They were with principals at consulting firms. They were with community leaders, nonprofit leaders. And they weren't always over coffee. Sometimes they were over conference room tables. But that's what I did. So each trip before I went, I had an agenda that I had put together with timing of this is when I'm meeting this person for lunch. And that's how I got my foot in the door. Ultimately, a year and a half, 2 years later, one of those people called me up and said, I'm leaving my job. I told my boss I would find a good replacement. And so it was that personal connection that ultimately worked for me. But that was the strategy.
That's amazing because you put in practice just all the points that I try to hammer anytime I can here on I'm always thinking of graduate students, so it's a bit different. But we talk about informational interviews, and I think that's what you did. But the thing is, you did it in person, and often what I recommend, because it's less investment in, and you don't have to be so afraid of going and meeting the person in person, is using LinkedIn to do kind of the same thing, and to start as early as possible in grad school. But you actually went, and like you said, you invested time and money in a very targeted strategy. And what was the thing that in the end brought you to this new space? Was a connection you had made 2 years earlier.
That's right.
And one very important thing that you mentioned is, okay, you may be looking for work, but don't have transactional conversations of, hey, do you have a job for me?
Exactly.
Because that's not a good place to be, to really have a relaxed person in front of you who's going to share, who's going to tell you what the day-to-day of the job is, who's going to show you the ropes in a certain way.
That's right. That's right. They can read between the lines. You don't need to come right out and do the hard sell. But again, it's sort of a longer-term strategy, because I still, to this very day, have many of those same connections, and I cultivate those relationships, and I will go have coffee with people just to keep the relationship going. But you're absolutely right. That's a tension that I felt that we have to be very careful. We don't want to come across, and we don't want to be, in fact, people who are just extracting things for our own benefit. And so for me, one of the key elements of networking and doing it in a way that feels right is looking for where's the mutual benefit and framing it that way and being upfront about that, right? Because I'm not looking to expand my circle of golf friends, right? I'm looking for professional connections. But I think framing it as, hey, I really think that we might be able to work together in the future because we have these overlapping interests, right? That's different than coming across as very sort of self-serving.
Super, super important point. And again, even if you're listening, you're in graduate school, and for you this is just going to be finding someone on LinkedIn who has a professional journey that you think, oh, this is cool. What that we just said, this that Terence just shared, is very, very, very important. I'm impressed at the investment and also at the advice that this mentor gave you. Put money aside. So this is something you need to, if you want to make this happen in a timely manner, you need to invest in it. Time and money, and it's an interesting point.
Certainly, yeah. And I will say this was exactly 10 years ago when I was doing this. So I don't even remember using LinkedIn at that time. I'm sure it existed, but this was pre-LinkedIn. But I am old school that way. Even in the post-COVID, hopefully, era that we're in, I still believe in the power of sitting down with somebody face to face and just having that conversation. So a few years ago, several years ago, actually, I was doing focus groups here in Philadelphia for a client, Philadelphia International Airport, and they wanted to look at market demand for business class travel between Philadelphia and Asia. And one of the participants in the focus group was an attorney who did a lot of work in Japan. And he told me, in Japan, business decisions are not made before the third face-to-face meeting, right? So I don't know if that was true, or I'm assuming it was, or whether it's still true, but there's a deep insight there, that human contact really does matter a lot of times.
Yeah, and one of the things that is interesting, or that I'd be interested in analyzing is, so you had a bunch of conversations. This is 2 years after you started doing it, and you met physically a bunch of people, and you couldn't. How can I say? You couldn't have predicted that this person or that person would be coming back to you, but you kind of believed in the process of creating and nourishing these relationships. And where I'm getting is, the earlier you start, the more relaxed you are, and also the more these kind of random occurrences of someone getting back to you, having thought of you for a position, can occur too. It's like throwing a net. It's not a good image, but
no, I absolutely see the image. And I don't use the term anymore because it sounds very aggressive, but I sort of used to say that I carpet bombed the East Coast with Terence. I just made sure as many people as possible knew my name, which, is a drop in the bucket when you're thinking about the region, but that was sort of my strategy. And, David, I often think about, sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, well, that person, they got ahead because they have connections, right? Well, the truth is, not everybody is born with connections, and making those connections is a skill in its own right. And so I think it's important to not just network, but to think about networking as a very valuable and marketable skill, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not just about getting a job. It's something that you'll be able to use once you land that job.
Mm-hmm. That's super, super interesting. And it's something also I've never looked at it that way as. And now that you mention it, I do know some people for whom this capacity for networking and even community building, when you get to a certain level, community building has been a game changer in their careers after their PhD, for sure. Like I have a couple of people in mind. Now, one thing, so this thing about having conversations and establishing like real connections with people, it's something that I really, really believe in, and I'm so happy that you bring it. That you bring it as kind of the centerpiece, or at least the starting point of this process of pivoting today. I'm really happy for that. Now, one of the things that I try to tell people, but I'd like to hear your experience, is what 20 minutes with someone can bring you. And often I talk in terms of, okay, you want to access let's say data science, and well, one thing you can learn by having conversations with people is the jargon of people who work in data science, which is not going to be the same as what you used doing statistics in your PhD. What are the things that having these conversations bring you that slowly transform you into a better and better candidate for a position in that space?
Again, this sounds self-serving, and it is, but one of the main things you get out of that 20-minute conversation is who should you talk to next, right? But also what you're getting out of the conversation sort of at an aggregate level is who's who. who are the players? What's that constellation of players in that industry? Because that's incredibly important to map out and just to have as knowledge. Apart from that, which I would say identifying the influencers would be, I always try to cultivate a macro level understanding of whatever the industry landscape is. And for me, that means understanding economic trends, understanding political trends, understanding social trends. So again, just at a high level, so not going into a networking meeting and trying to understand the specifics of something very, very technical or very nuanced, right? That you're not going to get that in 20 minutes. You want to start from a higher level and build that understanding of, again, what does the overall landscape look like? What are the trends? What are the patterns? What are the emerging events, right? And then who are the players? Because if you can then, go into, when you do get into the industry with that sort of broad understanding, it makes it, when you do the very technical work or the very nuanced work, right, you're able to understand that in a much different way.
And I imagine also that, and we haven't gotten there yet, but that whenever you have a first actual conversation about a position, and well, your case was special because someone thought of you and kind of brought you in, but that first conversation with the other people in the organization, you will sound as if you've been like swimming in this domain for years because you've done this homework, right?
That's right.
Very cool. Now we've talked about people, and I don't know if you have kind of a logical step of what comes next, but if you do, I'll let you follow it. But where now I have a curiosity is, we're talking about relationships with people and how that kind of brings us into a space and gets us more knowledge about the space, but also this question of networking. But then companies or government or organisms is a different, it's a different thing. Once you actually want to get into a position, there are processes to get hired. There are interviews you have to go through. And I'd be interested in knowing how you prepared yourself for that.
I think it is important to point out to listeners that my background and my degrees are in urban planning. I currently work as a strategic consultant in sort of the corporate communication space, so totally different. And whenever I tell that to people, they're often like, "Well, how did you go from urban planning to storytelling and market research?" Because it seems like it was a total break, but it wasn't. And so the strategy there is that I think about my professional journey sort of as a series of Venn circles, a Venn diagram where there's overlap between each circle. I kept making incremental changes, so sort of taking one step to the right and putting my right foot in a new professional world, but keeping my left foot in the old world, and doing that, continually. So there was this stepwise movement that I can explain to you how it played out, but that there's a very clearly identifiable thread through all of my professional experiences, that from where I was to where I am right now. Mm-hmm. So this brings up something that I think is very important, which is wherever you are in your professional journey, thinking about what are the parallel paths that exist right now, parallel to my particular journey, my road that I'm on. So in other words, where are the people who are basically doing exactly what I'm doing? They're just calling it something else. And then not only identifying where those parallel paths are, but if we continue with the analogy of a road, where is the next crossover or the next opportunity for me to cross the median safely, right? So that I can get on that other path. And then the third part is knowing, okay, I see it coming. What do I need to have in place in order to be able to make that transition? So step one is identifying where those other fields are, where you might be able to take your skills that you already have, which you first need to identify and market, right? Where can you take those skills and simply apply them, maybe with some additional knowledge and training, right? But apply them pretty seamlessly to some other line of work, because that's what I did.
Again, you really sum it up really well, and I almost don't have anything to add. But one of the things that I take from that, and that often is a challenge, especially if you're in graduate school, and probably when you wake up in the morning, what you envision in front of you is becoming a professor. And I think I mentioned that somewhere in the beginning of the interview, is there's kind of a multiverse, like in a Marvel universe now, there's like multiverse, and
Yes.
there's a Doctor Strange in Universe 1, but then there's Doctor Strange in Universe 200 and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And it what you just said makes me think of that, which is, first, oh, super interesting what the other Doctor Strange is doing in that universe, and I hope there's no copyright infringement now here. But interesting what he's doing. How do I teleport to that universe? And like you said, what like small increment of what skill, what course can I take? Let's say in programming, right now it's one of the things that people coming from sciences, a lot of them are going to data science, and then there's a specific set of software that I use, like Python and things like that. Oh, well, if I take this course in Python, all of a sudden I can teleport,
Yeah.
when I want. It's super interesting, and it makes total sense to me what you're saying.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I'm more of a DC Comics guy. I think about Bizarro Superman and Solomon Grundy. I don't know if you remember them, but same sort of concept. Parallel universe where there's an evil Superman. But yeah, how do you transition into that, into the upside down, to use a Stranger Things sort of analogy?
Yeah. And so one of the things that often graduate students is their issue with time. And you have mentioned that even for yourself in those first years of tenure track, you didn't have a lot of time either. So, and you were, those slivers of time, like you called them, you were really like maximizing what you could make out of them. Do you have a best practice that you could share on how to, even if your time is really allotted for different things in your graduate school day to day, to still be able to weekly or every 2 weeks incrementally do one little thing, and then you'll see at the end of the year, you look back and you're like, oh, I've learned this extra skill, or now I can actually go talk with people in this domain because I took this course in whatever. Because it's a challenge they always mention the students.
Yeah, I just last week was given a presentation within my company on decision models, and one of the models that we talked about was the Pareto principle, which I know you're familiar with. That idea that 80% of the impact that you're going to have is based on 20% of the effort that you're going to put in. So figuring out where that 20% is and focusing on that. Even before I understood what the Pareto principle was, I kind of used that as a strategy. And so I would look for, again, going back to the Venn diagram analogy, where were the areas of overlap, of convergence, so that I knew if I put my effort there, I was going to get maximize my output. So an example of that would be, if you're in graduate school and you're doing research work or research projects, right, as part of your research process, if you're doing stakeholder interviews, or if you're doing any sort of contextual research, right, don't just look at the interviews that you might do and the connections as data inputs. Look at those as long-term investments, right? Those are relationships that you're building. And so that's one way that you can do networking while you're doing research, I think. Certainly, academic conferences. Most graduate programs, well, I guess it depends on the program you're in, will provide graduate students, selectively with money to attend the annual conference, whatever your field is. So there again, that's not just an opportunity for you to go present your research findings or to sit back and listen to others. It's an opportunity to meet people, to network, and again, I think it's important that you think about those conferences not as you're going to go shake hands, have a few drinks, and move on. It's like you're looking for where are there mutually beneficial relationships that you can start to cultivate, right? But that's just the first step. Then it's this process of continuing to maintain those relationships. And I would also say it's the flip side of that is it takes a lot of effort to build those relationships. It takes very little effort to destroy them. But again, that's a topic for another time as well. So sort of understanding the fragility of some of those professional relationships as well.
So this concept of kind of bringing together two things that you thought might not be associated, but because you're already doing this one, like going to conferences, you can. I'm thinking of my domain. In conferences, usually there are booths of different sponsors. Oh, you can talk to those people and see. Some of them will be PhDs, or will have graduate degrees, and it's interesting. So be strategic in doing things without going too much off of your academic path, but seeing opportunities day to day that you might have ignored otherwise.
Yeah. Let me give you another example, David, to make it really applied. When I was teaching down at Appalachian State University, I made a real concentrated effort at least once a year to teach what we called studio courses. So this would be a course where my students and I would be working on and I'm doing this in air quotes, a real world project, meaning it would be a project that had been presented to us by a local government or a local nonprofit. So it was a real project that would last over the course of the semester, where we were working as a project team, and that we had a client. And my job as the professor would be to set up those relationships well before the semester ever started, right? So building those relationships in that professional community so that I could then see where is there a need, because then I could take it to the department chair, sell it as an idea for a course. She could take it to the dean, right? Get it funded, because obviously that's how it works, right? You got to get the class funded before it ever happens. So that's a perfect opportunity of where teaching and research can intersect with something that's really concrete, tangible, real world. And then if you do make the transition to the job market, so first of all, not only are your students getting this great experience where they'll have this portfolio of work to show at the end of a class, but you can point to your what's no longer a CV, but it's going to be a resume. You can point to it and say, here's a project that I worked on that, for a local government, and we had real deliverables. And so that's, again, just an example of how to reorient your thinking towards away from theory and more towards practice.
That's a great example. And there's some creativity in there. You for sure you're a creative thinker, but I think it can be inspiration for everyone. And some things I've seen with graduate students, and I always think of Adriana Bankston, who's now working in Washington. But for her, it was as a graduate student with other colleagues setting up this seminar series with alumni coming to talk about their careers and what they did outside academia, which she finished her degree long ago, but that seminar series continued ongoing. And that experience is very aligned with being a graduate student. And it's within the day-to-day of that life. Yeah. But really opened her doors to her, expanded her network. But also later on, she could, when she came on the show, it was one of the things she shared. So it's something you can share as, look at something I did in graduate school that was a little bit different and that was really eye-opening, et cetera, et cetera.
Totally. I love that. Yeah. Yeah. I'll tell you something that I did that was probably one of the funnest things I did when I was a professor. And it was when I knew I'd already turned in my resignation. So it was my last semester. We had a facility on our campus that did television production. And I stopped in and just started talking to them a little bit about an idea I had, because I knew I had one of these networking trips coming up. And I arranged for them, because I was teaching a big class with probably 120 students. So it was auditorium style seating with the big movie screen that came down. So we arranged for the production people to come into my class and set up the equipment. And then I actually phoned into the class by video remotely from Manhattan, right? And sort of like was walking around, showing, because it was an urban planning class, right? And was able to interact with my students, and the production people were able to give me close-ups of the students asking the questions, and it was beautiful. I mean, they loved it. I loved it. I hope the students did as well. And it was a little self-serving because I needed to be up there to do what I needed to do. But again, there are opportunities, I think, to get creative and sort of work a little bit outside of maybe what would normally be acceptable. But
no, I agree. It's sometimes it's first there's the creative, the idea needs to pop up in your mind, and then it's allowing yourself to believe it's a good idea, and then advocate for it to in front of whoever needs to sign the sign the check or whatever. But I think for students, there's a lot of opportunities like that present themselves. One of there's some easy ones, like here there's a Brain Awareness Week every year, and there's a few organizations in that week that ask graduate students to volunteer and to go to schools to teach about the brain, and they bring a calf brain, and they have these experiments, etc., etc. These are all little things that are aligned with what you're doing, but that when later on when you're talking, when you're showing your resume, it really shows a more 3D version of you versus just the academic. And that's what I find super, super interesting. And in your case, you're not just the professor who's like lecturing and pointing at a whiteboard or whatever. No, you brought different things, and you did this like multimedia class. It's super interesting, and it goes with this concept of mine of, and I just kind of alluded to it, of if you just show your CV or your resume and you send it, you're 2D, like the sheet of paper. But if you've invested in enriching your journey with other things, with some creative like juices of establishing connections, doing multidisciplinary things, etc., then you become 3D in a sense.
That's right.
Yeah, we're reaching sadly the end of the interview. I wonder whether you had another step to the process to add, or a final maybe the final chapter of that transition that you lived, that you want to share.
I think the final chapter always is take the mindset of lifelong learner. Every time that I've made the transition, a big career transition, even if it was incremental, it's been like starting graduate school again. I mean, 10 years ago when I transitioned out of academia into private sector consulting, I look back and laugh at how little I knew and how much I thought I knew, right? Because I had no idea about just, and this could be a topic for another time, the difference between how we see things in an academic environment versus how we see things in a business environment, how we communicate differently in those two contexts. But at the same time, figuring out what are the transferable skills. A couple pieces of advice to any graduate student listening to this. If you get the chance to teach courses while you're working on your PhD, do it, because that's public speaking experience, and that's highly marketable, and not everybody can do it. And when you have to stand up a couple times a week in front of 150 students or however many and project your voice to the back of the room, and you learn body language, right? That's a highly prized and marketable skill. So don't pass up that opportunity. I think the other thing to understand is that, so when we do research in a social science setting, we don't just suddenly say, okay, we're going to do surveys or we're going to do focus groups, right? There's a research design under which those particular methods make sense. And the research design is well understood, it's established, it's a model that others are, know is useful for this type of research question. In the business world, and for that matter, in the government world as well, we shouldn't go straight to tactics whenever we're trying to solve a problem. Instead, we should think about what's the strategy under which those tactics make sense. So what I'm saying is I've seen that there's analogous thinking between research design, strategy, research methods, and tactics. And always, so the PhD experience for me cultivated that type of an analytical mindset where I was always asking myself, what is the larger strategy, even though I wasn't calling it that. And that's very, very useful in all sorts of settings outside academia. And the other thing is, when you're working on a research project, one of the very first things that you learn is to ask yourself some foundational questions. what is my research question? Why is this important? Who's it important to? How are the findings going to be used, right? So those are also questions that are great to ask in any corporate board meeting or any internal company meeting. Why are we meeting? What's the point of this meeting? What do we hope to have accomplished at the end of this 45 minutes, right? How are we going to use the information? Who's doing what next when? So it's that very systematic sort of upfront thinking. Again, it's an analytical mindset. It's very transferable outside academia. So I would just encourage people to give some thought to identifying those characteristics or skills that you're learning through your PhD studies and thinking about, okay, what do they look like in the upside down world, or right in the bizarro universe? What are they called by a different name?
I would kind of loop back to the beginning, to that first step that you mentioned of talking, having informational interviews with people. And once you're kind of going back home from that informational interview, try to think of the words mentioned, if you talked about the day-to-day of the job, and try to make connections from that the person shared to what you do in graduate school. And slowly you'll be able to, maybe it won't be apparent the first time, but eventually you'll see these patterns and you say, okay, like you mentioned, public speaking, interesting, that's appreciated in this domain that I want to go into. I will mention it whenever I apply for a position.
Yeah.
The danger is, because we live in graduate school, we live in that, we don't see these things. They're invisible to us. And I'm super, super appreciative that you're putting them out there and saying them so that people can realize and have that aha of, oh, actually, I'm doing this, but I'm also doing, it can also be called this, and people out there appreciate it. Super
100%.
important.
Yeah. And research, just last piece of advice, to the extent that you can, if you're a quantitative researcher, try to get some qualitative research experience as well. If you're a qualitative researcher as a graduate student, try to get some quantitative research experience. Having that combination, I think, is really helpful and important. As you know, I'm head of qualitative insights at Storyline Strategies, right? So my primary job is not only facilitating focus groups and in-depth interviews and ethnographies and all of that, it's helping to build out that function of our job. But I work for a firm that offers best-in-class research, really combined with best-in-class storytelling. So it really is an opportunity, a unique opportunity for me to take some of the skills that I developed as a researcher and apply them in this, as you said, creative way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually, I was going to ask you where people can reach out to you, but I'm just, the company you mentioned is called Storyline Strategies. And for people on YouTube or LinkedIn, it's scrolling down here right now, storylinestrategies.com. Apart from Facebook, where people can find you as Terence Milstead too, what's the best, if someone listened to this interview and they're like, oh man, Terence really shared some cool stuff, but I'd like to ask him a few questions, what's the best way to reach out to you?
I'm on LinkedIn, active on LinkedIn. And of course, they can always reach out. My email address is terencemilstead@gmail.com. But either of those, LinkedIn or Gmail, is the best way to get in touch with me. Because I do periodically offer individualized coaching. My time is pretty booked right now, but from time to time, I do individualized coaching. So I'm always happy to have conversations with anybody.
Great. So you know what? I'll get your LinkedIn link and also put it in the show notes so people can reach out to you. Terence, this was great. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. You've put words and examples on things that I've reflected on and that I try to share, but all in one go. It was awesome.
I really enjoyed it, David. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Beyond the Thesis with Papa Ph.D. with me, David Mendes, and my guest, Terence Milstead. If this conversation resonated with you, you can be sure it will resonate with someone else. And future you will need great colleagues. So share to start the butterfly effect. And if you really, really liked it, take a minute or two to leave a comment or a review on whichever platform you're using to listen to me at this moment. Other than buying me a coffee or jumping on the Patreon, it's one of the best ways you can support me as a podcaster. Looking forward to reading you.